"Say goodbye quickly," her husband said, looking up from his phone. "I have somewhere to be." Amara Whitlock thought he meant the airport, maybe another one of the sudden business trips that had become routine over the last year. She smiled, kissed his cheek, and watched him back the car out of the driveway without another word. 3 hours later, her phone exploded with sound. 36 missed calls, every single one from him. Then came a voicemail, his voice trembling in a way she had never heard before. "Please, don't go home," he said. "Whatever you do, stay away from the house." Her stomach dropped as she played it a second time, and then a third, and somewhere underneath the fear was a colder realization that someone had entered their home while she was gone, and whatever they had found inside had turned her husband's goodbye into a desperate warning. Amara Whitlock had spent 12 years believing that her marriage was the one stable structure in a life otherwise built on discipline and hard-won ambition. She had built a company from nothing, learned to read contracts the way other people read novels, and trusted, above all else, that the man she had married was as honest with her as she had always been with him. That belief had carried her through a decade of shared mornings, quiet arguments, and the slow accumulation of a life that felt, to her, entirely solid. What she did not yet know, standing in that coffee shop with the phone trembling in her hand, was that the solid ground beneath her had already begun to crack weeks earlier, silently, one small lie at a time, and that the next several days would strip away every assumption she had ever made about the man she loved. It began on an ordinary Thursday morning, the kind that gave no warning of what was coming. Amara had been getting ready to meet a friend for lunch, running a brush through her hair in the hallway mirror, when Callum appeared behind her with a tightness in his shoulders that she noticed but did not yet understand. He did not explain himself. He did not wrap his arms around her the way he usually did before she left the house. He did not ask where she was going or when she would be back, which was unlike him, because Callum Mercer always asked, always wanted to know her schedule down to the hour. Instead, he simply said the words that would replay in her mind for weeks afterward, that she should say goodbye quickly because he had somewhere to be. Amara noticed him, glancing at his phone every few seconds, the screen lighting up with a name he angled away from her, and when it rang, he silenced it instead of answering in front of her, which was also unlike him. She asked if everything was okay, and he told her it was perfectly fine, but his face told a different story entirely. A story of a man trying very hard to hold something together with his bare hands. There were small details she filed away without meaning to, the kind of details a woman notices about her husband after 12 years of marriage, even when she is not looking for them. He locked his phone screen too quickly when she walked past. A brown envelope sat on the edge of the kitchen table, unopened, addressed to no one she recognized. He asked her, twice, exactly when she planned to return, phrasing it so casually that she almost missed how deliberate it was. He told her not to call his work line that afternoon, that he would be unreachable, and when she reached for his hand to say goodbye, she felt it tremble slightly before he pulled it back and turned toward the window. She almost asked him about the envelope. The question had risen to her lips and nearly escaped before she swallowed it back down, telling herself it was probably nothing, some piece of paperwork from his firm, that he would explain later over dinner the way he always did. Callum had always been a man of careful routines, a man who ironed his own shirts and left for the office at exactly the same time every morning, and the sight of him standing in the kitchen with his hair slightly disheveled, his tie loosened before 9 in the morning, struck her as odd enough to remember, but not odd enough, in that moment, to question aloud. 12 years of marriage builds a particular kind of faith, the kind that fills in gaps with reassurance rather than suspicion, and Amara let that faith carry her past the strangeness of the morning, the way it had carried her past 100 smaller oddities before it. Amara still trusted him completely in that moment, because 12 years of marriage does not unravel from a single strange morning, and so she gathered her purse and walked out to her car without looking back. Callum stood at the door and watched her go, his expression unreadable, and it was only after her car disappeared around the bend at the end of their street that his face changed completely, the mask falling away to reveal something closer to panic. He pulled out his phone the moment she was gone and dialed a number he had clearly been dreading to call. "She's gone," he said, his voice low and clipped. And on the other end of the line, a man's voice asked a single question that would have chilled Amara to the bone had she been standing there to hear it. Did she see the file? Callum said nothing at all, and the silence stretched long enough to answer the question on its own. 3 hours later, Amara was sitting at a small corner table in a coffee shop downtown, halfway through a conversation with her friend about nothing in particular, when her phone began to buzz against the wood of the table. One call, then another, then a flood of them, arriving so fast that the screen seemed to shudder under the weight of it, and when she finally looked down, she saw the number that made her chest tighten instantly. 36 missed calls, all from Callum, all within the span of less than an hour. He had never called her like that before, not once in 12 years, not even the year his mother had passed away, and the sheer volume of it told Amara something was catastrophically wrong before she even understood what. She called him back immediately, her hands unsteady, but no one answered on the other end, only the hollow ring of a phone left unattended, somewhere she couldn't see. Then a voicemail notification appeared, and Amara pressed it to her ear with her friend watching her face change in real time. Callum's voice came through broken and rushed, stripped of the composure he always wore like a second skin. "Please, don't go home," he said. "Whatever you do, stay away from the house." The message ended there, cut off mid-breath, as though something or someone had interrupted him before he could finish. Amara sat frozen for a long moment, running through every possibility her mind could conjure, wondering if he had been in an accident, if something had happened at his office, if this was some kind of cruel misunderstanding that would resolve itself the moment she reached him. Before she could call again, a text arrived from a number she did not recognize, 4 words that landed like a stone in still water. "He should have told you the truth." Amara called Celine Baptiste next, because Celine was the person she called when the ground felt unsteady beneath her, a friend of nearly 2 decades, who also happened to be one of the sharpest attorneys Amara had ever known. Celine told her, in the calm and measured voice she used when something was seriously wrong, not to go anywhere near the house alone, to wait, to let her drive over first. She asked Amara to read the text message, aloud again, slowly, and when Amara did, Celine went quiet on the other end of the line in a way that unsettled her more than the message itself had. That silence, brief as it was, told Amara that her friend had already begun turning over possibilities she did not yet want to say out loud. But Amara had never been the kind of woman who waited well, and 12 years of trusting her husband completely made it almost impossible for her to imagine that the warning in his voice was about anything other than danger to her, not danger from her own home. Her friend across the table had gone quiet, watching her with the particular concern reserved for people who have just watched someone's entire expression change in the span of a few seconds, and Amara offered only a hurried apology and an excuse about an emergency before gathering her things and heading for the door. She thanked Celine, told her she would be careful, and drove toward the neighborhood she had lived in for over a decade, with a knot forming in her stomach that refused to loosen, her hands gripping the wheel tighter with every passing mile. When she turned onto her street, the first thing she noticed was the garage door standing open, though she remembered closing it herself that morning, the way she always did out of habit. She parked at the curb instead of the driveway, some instinct keeping her from pulling all the way in, and stepped out slowly into the quiet afternoon. A car she did not recognize sat parked along the side of the house, sleek and dark and utterly out of place on their tree-lined street, its front license plate conspicuously missing. Amara stood beside her own car for a moment, scanning the windows of the house she had shared with her husband for over a decade, and that was when she saw it, the front door standing several inches ajar, swaying faintly in the breeze, as though someone had left in a hurry and never bothered to close it behind them. She stepped inside cautiously, her heels silent against the hardwood as she moved through the front hallway, and at first glance everything appeared untouched. The furniture in its place, the photographs still hanging where they always had. The house held the same stillness it always did in the middle of the afternoon, sunlight falling in long stripes across the living room floor, and for one brief, foolish moment Amara allowed herself to believe that nothing was wrong at all, that the open garage and the strange car outside were simply coincidences stacked carelessly on top of an already strange day. But within seconds, the wrongness of the scene revealed itself in small, sharp details. A drawer in the entryway table had been pulled open and left that way. Papers that usually sat neatly stacked on the kitchen counter were scattered across the floor, some of them bearing the faint impression of a shoe print near the edge of the rug. Callum's home office, normally locked and immaculate, stood wide open with files pulled from the cabinets and strewn across the desk, drawers hanging half out like open mouths, and behind the bookshelf, where a small safe had always been hidden, the door of that safe now hung open on its hinges. Amara realized in that moment that she had never once been given the combination to that safe in 12 years of marriage, and yet here it was, emptied and exposed, its contents gone as though they had never existed at all. She stood in the doorway of that office for a long moment, listening to the house breathe around her, half expecting to hear footsteps somewhere upstairs, or the creak of a door closing in another room. Nothing moved. Whoever had been there was long gone, and the silence that remained felt heavier for it, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath along with her. She moved to the kitchen and pulled up their joint bank account on her phone, with hands that would not quite stop shaking, and what she found there stole the breath from her lungs. A significant sum of money had been transferred out of their account that very morning, a transfer she had never authorized, sent to an entity she had never heard of before in her life. Mercer Holdings Advisory. The name sat on the screen like an accusation, familiar enough to bear her husband's name, and foreign enough to feel like a stranger had walked directly through the center of her marriage. She called Callum again, and this time, finally, he answered, his voice flooding with something close to relief the instant he heard hers. "Amara, thank God," he said, and she asked him, as steadily as she could manage, what exactly had happened. He told her only to leave the house, to get out immediately, and when she pressed him for a reason, he said simply that they were looking for something. "What?" she asked, and the silence that followed told her more than any answer could have. Amara understood then that her husband was not merely trying to protect her from some outside danger. He was afraid of what she might discover if she stayed in that house a moment longer, and that fear was, in its own way, a confession. She walked toward his office and sat down at the desk, opening his laptop with fingers that no longer trembled from fear alone, but from something colder and more purposeful. A folder had been deleted recently, its ghost still visible in the recovery log, labeled with 2 letters and a single word that made her blood run cold. A W. Final. Her own initials, staring back at her from a file her husband had tried and failed to erase before she could ever see it. She managed to recover a single surviving fragment from that deleted folder. A document that had somehow escaped complete destruction, and its title alone was enough to send a fresh wave of dread through her chest. Transfer of ownership. Amara opened it with the strange, detached calm of a woman preparing herself for something she already suspected would be terrible, and what she found inside confirmed every fear that had been building since the moment she stepped through that front door. It was not, as some smaller and more hopeful part of her had briefly imagined, a divorce filing prepared in secret. It was worse than that. It was a legal document transferring ownership of assets that belonged solely to her, assets she had built and protected long before she had ever met Callum Mercer, into the hands of a company she had never heard of and never agreed to work with. She read it twice, then a third time, searching for some clause, some footnote that might explain it away, as a misunderstanding rather than what it plainly appeared to be. At the bottom of the page, in the careful loops she recognized instantly as her own handwriting, sat her signature. Amara stared at it for a long moment, because she had never signed that document in her life. And yet there it was, perfect and damning, staring back at her from a screen in her own home. She held her own hand up beside the screen without quite meaning to, comparing the shape of her fingers to the shape of that signature, as though some part of her still needed physical proof that the two things belonged to different origins entirely, one drawn from years of practiced habit and the other manufactured to deceive. She began, almost against her will, to trace back through the years of their marriage with new and unwelcome clarity. The business trips that had grown more frequent and less explained. The accounts she had glimpsed once or twice on shared statements and never questioned, because Callum always had an answer ready, always said, "Trust me," in that steady voice that made questioning feel unnecessary and almost unkind. She remembered a dinner 2 years earlier when he had come home late, smelling faintly of a restaurant she did not recognize, and how easily he had folded the explanation into their evening. A client meeting that ran long, nothing more. She remembered the anniversary he had rescheduled twice for reasons that seemed urgent at the time, and now felt, in hindsight, deliberately vague. None of it had seemed significant on its own. Stacked together now, in the ruins of a single afternoon, it formed a pattern she could no longer pretend not to see. She realized now, standing in the wreckage of her own office, how thoroughly she had been led, one reassurance at a time, away from ever asking the questions that mattered. It was not that Callum had told her elaborate lies. It was that he had simply withheld enough of the truth, in small enough pieces, that she had never had reason to look closer, and that omission, she understood now, was its own quiet form of betrayal, patient and deliberate, in a way that felt almost more painful than a single dramatic deception might have been. Celine arrived not long after, letting herself in with the spare key Amara had given her years earlier, her expression grim the moment she saw the state of the office. She did not waste time asking questions Amara could not yet answer, and instead simply rolled up her sleeves and began sorting the scattered papers into careful piles, the practiced efficiency of a woman who had spent her career finding order inside other people's chaos. Together the two women sat at the kitchen table, sorting through what remained of the scattered files, cross-referencing dates and account numbers late into the evening, as the light outside slowly faded from gold to gray. It was Celine who found the detail that turned suspicion into something closer to certainty, evidence that Callum had used Amara's financial information as collateral to secure an enormous loan, one that, if it defaulted, could strip her of nearly everything she had spent her adult life building. She slid the document across the table without a word, watching Amara's face as she read it, and said nothing at all while her friend absorbed the full weight of what it meant. Amara listened to her friend explain the mechanics of it in a lawyer's careful, unhurried language, and felt something inside her go very quiet and very still, the way the air goes still before a storm finally breaks. Callum came home while they were still at the table, and this time he did not try to pretend that everything was fine. He stood in the doorway of his own kitchen, looking like a man who had run out of places to hide. Amara asked him how long he had been lying to her, and he answered that it had been long enough that he believed, somewhere in the tangled logic of his own guilt, that he had been trying to protect her the entire time. She laughed, but there was no humor in it at all. "You call stealing my identity protection?" she asked him, and he had no answer that did not sound like an excuse, only that he had run out of choices, that the walls had closed in around him, faster than he had known how to manage. Amara asked him the question that had been building in her chest since she first saw that forged signature. Who exactly was he protecting her from? Callum's eyes flicked toward the front door before he could stop them, and a voice she did not recognize answered the question for him, calm and unhurried, arriving from the hallway with the confidence of a man who had never once doubted his own welcome. "From me," the voice said, and a moment later, Everett Shaw stepped into the kitchen as though he owned every square inch of it. Everett carried himself with the kind of composed authority that made a room feel smaller the instant he entered it, his suit immaculate, his tone almost gentle, which somehow made him more unsettling rather than less. He moved through the kitchen the way a man moves through a room he has already decided belongs to him, pausing to glance at the family photographs on the wall as though appraising them, before finally settling into a chair across from Amara without waiting to be invited. There was no hostility in his voice when he spoke, only a kind of patient, unhurried confidence that made his presence far more threatening than any raised voice could have been. He explained, without any real urgency, that Callum owed him a great deal, and not only in money. He explained that Callum had used a portion of Amara's assets as collateral against a debt that had grown far beyond either of their control. But Amara, listening closely, began to sense that money alone was not what had brought this man into her home. Everett wanted something else entirely, something older and more personal, and it took her only a few more sentences to understand exactly what that was. Amara watched him as he spoke, cataloging the small details, the way she might have during a difficult negotiation at her own company, the practiced calm in his hands, the way he chose each word as though it had been rehearsed long before he ever walked through her front door. This was not a man improvising. This was a man executing a plan he had likely been building for months, and Callum, standing silently against the counter with his eyes fixed on the floor, was clearly not the one who had ever truly controlled the terms of it. Long before she had ever met Callum Mercer, Amara had built a small company on her own, quietly and carefully, and that company now held the rights to a patent worth far more than either man in that kitchen had initially let on. She had never sold it, never signed away a single share of it, and yet Callum had spent months trying to gain control of that company through documents she had never seen and signatures she had never given. Everett watched her put the pieces together with something close to admiration in his expression, the look of a man who respected competence even when it worked against him. "Your husband made one mistake," he told her, and when she asked which one, his answer came without hesitation. "He married a woman who reads contracts." That single sentence marked the moment Amara stopped feeling like a woman standing in the wreckage of her own life and started feeling like a woman preparing to reclaim it. Something in her posture changed, subtle but unmistakable, a straightening of the spine that both men in that kitchen seemed to notice at the same time, though neither of them said anything about it. She began asking sharper questions, watching both men more closely, tracking the small tells that had once been invisible to her, but now seemed to stand out in sharp relief, the way Everett's confidence flickered slightly whenever she pressed too precisely on a detail he had not expected her to know. Slowly, she understood the true shape of that morning's strange goodbye. Callum had not rushed her out of the house because he wanted her gone. He had rushed her out because he knew a group of people were coming to search for documents he had been desperately trying to keep hidden from her for months. And he had believed, in his own flawed and frightened way, that getting her out of the house was the only thing he could still control. It was, she realized, both an act of cowardice and an act of protection, tangled together so tightly that even he probably could not separate the two anymore. Later that evening, once Everett had finally left and the house had gone quiet again, Callum admitted the rest without being asked. He told her that the 36 calls had come after he learned the plan had changed without warning, that Everett no longer simply wanted the documents recovered, but wanted Amara removed entirely from the transaction, her signature secured on the final transfer, whether she understood what she was signing or not. Amara looked at him for a long moment before she spoke again, her voice quiet but unwavering. "You said you were protecting me," she reminded him, and he answered that he had been, that every frantic call had been an attempt to warn her before it was too late. "Then why," she asked, "did you forge my signature in the first place?" Callum told her everything after that, the whole ugly shape of it laid bare across the kitchen table like the scattered files that had started this. He had borrowed money from Everett years earlier to save his own failing investment firm, a decision made in desperation during a period he had never fully shared with her, a stretch of months when he had told her business was simply slow, rather than admit how close he had come to losing everything he had built before they had even married. When that investment collapsed anyway, Everett had pressured him into using Amara's assets as collateral, framing it at first as a formality, a temporary arrangement that would never actually come into play. Callum had believed him, or had wanted to believe him badly enough that the distinction stopped mattering. Rather than confessing the truth and facing what it might cost him, Callum had chosen instead to forge a single signature, believing it would be a temporary fix, a problem contained to one document that no one would ever look closely enough to question. One signature became several. Several became a pattern he could no longer control or undo. Each new forgery justified in his own mind as the last one, the final piece needed to buy enough time to fix everything quietly before Amara ever had to know. He described it now with a kind of hollow clarity, as though hearing himself say the words aloud for the first time made the full weight of what he had done impossible to escape. Somewhere in that slow accumulation of small betrayals, Amara had been quietly and methodically stripped of the very thing she had built with her own hands, without ever knowing it was happening, her trust used against her by the one person who was supposed to protect it above all else. She asked him, her voice steady, even as something inside her cracked, whether any of it had been real at all. Callum told her that every moment with her had been real, that his love for her had never once been the lie, only his silence had been. She answered that if that were true, he should have trusted her with the truth, long before it arrived in the shape of 36 missed calls and a stranger standing in her kitchen. Callum had no response to that, because there was none that could undo what had already been done. This was the moment the story stopped, being only a mystery about a missing file and a forged signature, and became something closer to the slow autopsy of a marriage that had been quietly dying for longer than either of them had admitted. Amara did not forgive him that night, and she did not transform into a woman consumed by vengeance either. She simply decided, with the same clear-eyed discipline that had built her company from nothing, that she was going to take back control of her own life, piece by piece, starting immediately. Celine found the crack in Everett's plan the following morning, buried in the paperwork they had recovered. Everett needed Amara's genuine signature to finalize the transfer, but a forged version of that signature had already been used earlier in the process, which meant there was now a clear, provable timeline showing that Everett had known from the very beginning that at least one of those documents was fraudulent. Amara looked at Callum across the table and asked him plainly whether he truly wanted to protect her. When he nodded, she told him exactly what that would require. "Help me destroy what you built," she said. And for the first time since that strange goodbye 3 days earlier, Callum did not hesitate before agreeing. Amara refused to call the police immediately, choosing instead to gather every piece of evidence she would need before making a single move. She had learned, over years of building her own company from nothing, that acting too quickly on instinct alone was often the surest way to lose an advantage that patience could have preserved, and she was not willing to let one impulsive decision undo everything she still had left to protect. She and Celine spent the following days constructing a careful plan, one built on patience rather than anger, mapping out every document Everett would need, every step he would have to take, every place along that path where he might be tempted to reveal more than he intended. Amara allowed Callum to believe, and by extension allowed Everett to believe, that she had grown frightened enough to simply want the entire ordeal over, that she was prepared to sign whatever paperwork would finally make the threat disappear from her life. It cost her something to perform that fear convincingly, to let her voice shake on cue during a phone call she knew was likely being monitored, to sit across from Callum at dinner, and let him believe she had quietly resigned herself to whatever came next. Everett, confident and unaware that he was walking into anything but a routine surrender, began communicating more freely than he ever should have, sending emails, outlining terms, attaching documents that laid out exactly what he expected from her, each message another brick in the wall of evidence, quietly assembling itself around him, arriving in Celine's careful digital archive one by one, like pieces of a puzzle finally locking into place. Playing the part of a woman who had run out of fight took more from Amara than she expected, because every instinct in her wanted to confront him directly, to demand accountability in the moment, rather than waiting for the evidence to speak for itself. But she held the performance steady, appearing anxious and compliant, in every meeting while Celine worked behind the scenes, documenting each exchange with the precision of someone building a case brick by brick. When Everett finally arranged a private meeting to finalize everything, demanding her signature on the last remaining document, Amara sat across from him with a pen in her hand and let the silence stretch just long enough to unsettle him before she spoke. "Before I sign," she said, "I have one question." Everett, ever composed, asked what it was. Amara looked him directly in the eye and asked why the money had been transferred 3 full days before her signature had ever appeared on the corresponding paperwork. The question landed in the room like a struck match, and for the first time since he had walked into her kitchen days earlier, Everett Shaw had nothing ready to say. His silence was the sound of a careful plan collapsing in real time, and Amara felt something settle inside her chest that was not quite triumph but was close enough to feel like breathing after being underwater for a long time. Moments later, an automated notification appeared on her phone, confirming that an evidence package had been successfully uploaded and delivered, containing every email, every document, every recorded inconsistency Celine had spent days assembling. It had gone directly to Amara's attorney and to the appropriate authorities, arriving before Everett had even fully registered what her question had revealed. The trap she and Celine had built with such careful patience had finally closed. In the days that followed, the true meaning of those 36 calls finally revealed itself in full. After Amara left the house that morning, Callum had discovered that Everett's plan had shifted without warning, that the men involved no longer intended merely to retrieve documents, but intended to force Amara's genuine signature onto the final transfer, whether through pressure or deception or something far worse. He described sitting in his car outside his own office, watching the minutes pass, dialing her number again and again with no idea what he would even say if she picked up, because the truth was too large and too damning to explain in the space of a single frightened phone call. He had called her again and again, unable to explain clearly over the phone, because he believed, correctly as it turned out, that his line was no longer private, that somewhere in the chain of people now involved, a call answered carelessly could have made everything far worse, far faster. Each of those 36 calls had been an attempt to reach her before it was too late, a desperate, fumbling effort to undo a fraction of the harm he had already caused, and Amara understood now, hearing him describe it, that the number itself had become a kind of ledger, one call for every minute he had spent afraid of what his own choices might cost the person he claimed to love most. Amara acknowledged this when Callum tried to explain it to her once more, but acknowledgement was not the same as absolution. "Your fear doesn't erase what you did," she told him, and he agreed quietly that it did not. "And loving me," she continued, "doesn't make betrayal disappear either." He agreed with that too, because there was nothing left in him to argue with. There was no easy scene of forgiveness in that kitchen, no gentle music swelling behind a reconciliation. Neither of them had earned yet. Callum simply accepted what was coming, and for the first time in a long while, Amara saw something in him that looked less like the confident man she had married, and more like someone finally willing to face the consequences of his own choices. The authorities arrived not long after, and Everett Shaw was taken into custody amid a swirl of financial charges that would take months to fully untangle. Callum, too, was asked to cooperate with the investigation into his own role in the forged documents, a request he did not resist. Amara understood, watching it all unfold from the porch of the home that had once felt entirely safe, that the war with Everett had ended, but the far quieter, far more painful question of her marriage remained completely unanswered. In the weeks that followed, Everett faced the full weight of the legal consequences his greed had built for him, the fraudulent transactions frozen and unwound one by one until Amara's assets were fully restored and her company returned entirely to her own control. The process was slower and more tedious than any of the tense confrontations that had preceded it, filled with hearings and depositions and long afternoons spent in Celine's office, reviewing paperwork that had once been used to steal from her and was now being used, piece by piece, to give it all back. Callum, for his part, did not attempt to run from what he had done. He surrendered every remaining document in his possession and admitted formally to the signatures he had forged, choosing, for perhaps the first time in the entire ordeal, to face the truth head-on rather than manage it from the shadows. He hired his own attorney, separate from anything involving Amara, and cooperated fully with investigators, even when doing so meant implicating himself further, a decision that cost him his position at the firm and very nearly his freedom, but one he made without asking Amara to intervene on his behalf. Amara chose not to pursue revenge against him beyond what the law itself required, because revenge had never truly been what she wanted. She wanted the truth, plainly and completely. And once she had it, she found she had very little appetite left for punishing him further. There was a strange kind of relief in that realization, in discovering that she did not need to watch him suffer in order to feel whole again, that her own peace did not depend on his ruin. Before the investigation formally closed, Callum asked to see her one final time, and she agreed, more out of a need for closure than any lingering hope of reconciliation. They met at a small restaurant neither of them had ever been to before, neutral ground, a place with no shared memories attached to it, and for a long while, neither of them said very much at all, letting the quiet sit between them the way it never used to, when they were still pretending everything was fine. He told her that he had once believed losing everything, the money, the company, the house, would be the worst thing that could ever happen to him. She asked him what he believed now. Losing your trust was worse, he said, and Amara did not cry when she heard it. She only told him to remember exactly what that trust had cost him, because some lessons are only useful if the pain of learning them is never allowed to fade. He nodded slowly, and for the first time since that Thursday morning, she believed that he actually understood what she meant, not as an apology to be accepted, but as a fact he would now have to carry with him. They did not return to each other in the weeks that followed, not in any of the ways old habit might have suggested. Amara chose herself first, deliberately, and without apology, something she realized she had not fully done in longer than she wanted to admit. She spent those weeks rebuilding routines that belonged entirely to her. Mornings that started with silence instead of small talk, evenings that ended without waiting for a car in the driveway, and she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that the silence did not frighten her the way she once might have expected it to. In a small, unexpected gesture near the end of it all, Callum brought her a plain wooden box containing every remaining document, proving her rightful, sole ownership of the company she had built from nothing, papers he could easily have destroyed or hidden to protect whatever remained of his own interests. He set the box on her porch steps, rather than knocking, a small act of restraint that told her he understood, finally, that he no longer had the right to walk through her front door uninvited. Amara opened it later that evening, alone, and found the documents arranged with a kind of careful order that surprised her, each one labeled, each one exactly where it should be. He chose to hand them over freely, rather than let them disappear along with everything else that had unraveled, and Amara understood, holding that box in her hands, that it was the first genuinely selfless thing he had done since the morning he told her to say goodbye quickly. It did not undo what had come before it, but it was, in its own small way, a beginning of something honest between them, even if that something would never again resemble a marriage. Months passed, and Amara rebuilt her life on terms that finally belonged entirely to her. She reclaimed full control of her company, watched it steady itself and grow again under her own careful direction, and eventually moved into a new home, smaller and quieter than the one she had shared with Callum, but entirely, undeniably hers. She chose the paint colors herself, arranged the furniture without needing to consult anyone, and hung new photographs on the walls, pictures of friends and milestones that belonged only to this new chapter of her life rather than the one that had come before it. Celine remained close through all of it, the kind of steady presence that asked nothing in return for her loyalty, and the two women often sat together on Amara's new porch in the evenings, talking about everything except the parts of the story that no longer needed retelling. Amara's company grew steadier with each passing quarter, the patent she had fought so hard to keep finally generating the kind of return she had always believed it could, and there was a particular satisfaction in watching something she had built with her own hands thrive again after coming so close to losing it entirely. The chaos of that single Thursday afternoon slowly receded into memory, though it never fully disappeared, the way a scar fades without ever completely vanishing. Some mornings, she still caught herself glancing at her phone a beat too long before answering, some small residue of the fear that had once lived in 36 missed calls. But even that reflex, softened with time, replaced gradually by the simple, unremarkable comfort of a life that no longer required her to brace herself for what might be waiting behind a closed door. One evening, sitting alone in the calm of her new living room, her phone lit up with a message from Callum. It was not a plea for her to come back. It was not a declaration that he needed her. It was simply a single sentence, plain and unadorned. "I hope you're finally at peace." Amara read it once, then set the phone face down on the cushion beside her, letting the words settle rather than rushing to answer them the way she might have months earlier, back when every message from him had carried the weight of an emergency. She looked out the window for a long while, letting the memory of that day rise up one final time before she allowed herself to release it. The words say goodbye quickly. The 36 missed calls, arriving one after another like a countdown she had not known she was living through. The front door left open in the afternoon light, swaying faintly on its hinges. The forged signature that had once made her question everything she thought she knew about her own marriage, every anniversary, every quiet Sunday morning, every promise made in the dark. And beneath all of it, finally, the truth, plain and unglamorous, and entirely her own to carry now. Callum was never rewarded with a return to the life he had once had, the comfortable illusion of a marriage built quietly on secrets and half-truths. But he was given something else instead, a narrow and difficult chance to prove, through action rather than apology, that he understood exactly what he had lost. He rebuilt his own life, slowly and without shortcuts, taking a smaller position at a different firm, one where no one knew his name well enough to expect anything from him but honest work. And though Amara heard about it only secondhand, through mutual acquaintances who mentioned it in passing, she found she could hear it now without the old ache rising up behind it. Amara, for her part, was no longer the woman who had lived inside a marriage built on things left unsaid. She had taken her life back, deliberately and completely, one careful decision at a time, and there was a quiet strength in her now that had not been there before. Not because the betrayal had made her stronger, but because surviving it honestly had. She had learned, in the hardest way possible, the difference between trust that is given freely and trust that is simply assumed, and she carried that lesson forward, not as a wound, but as a kind of compass, one she intended to use far more carefully from that point on. On her way out the door that evening, her phone buzzed one final time, with a new message glowing on the screen. "Thank you for giving me the chance to become someone worthy of the truth," it read. And Amara allowed herself a small, quiet smile as she read it, the kind of smile that held no bitterness left inside it, only the faint, distant recognition of how far both of them had come from that Thursday morning in the kitchen. She did not turn back toward the house. She did not feel the sharp, familiar sting of anger rising in her chest the way it once would have, back when even the sound of his name could unravel an entire afternoon. The evening air outside was cool and unremarkable, the kind of ordinary evening she had once taken entirely for granted, and she stood on the porch for a moment, simply breathing it in, aware in a way she had not been before, of how rare and valuable ordinary really was. She simply stepped out into the evening air, carrying with her the strange and complicated peace of a woman who had finally stopped waiting for someone else to tell her the truth, and had instead gone out and found it herself, piece by piece, document by document, until nothing remained hidden that had the power to hurt her again. Sometimes the goodbye that breaks a heart is the very same goodbye that finally sets it free.